Hi, this is Ms. Lancaster. So touching base with you with chapter 9. Okay, so chapter 9 is another inequality chapter. This one is about sex, gender, and sexuality. It kind of starts out with this breakdown between an essentialist approach and a constructionist approach. I kind of keep in mind as you're thinking about this that sociologists tend to talk about social constructions, right? So the constructionist approach is really kind of a way of how we socially construct and acknowledge that categories of sex, male, female, and masculinity, and gender, masculinity, and femininity are socially constructed ideas of ways that we classify people. Whereas an essentialist approach is going to much more look at the biological or genetic aspects that are kind of determining how behaviors are. So this essentialist and constructionist approach that your book is talking about is really in looking at how society, how there's these two broad ways in which we look at gender, right? And the relationship between that and biology. So just kind of recognizing that one side is basically saying that we're genetically predisposed to act a certain way, to be a certain way, to do certain things, whereas the other, the constructionist approach, is basically saying society shapes us and creates us and helps us to determine what is normal for those sex and gender. So the reality of what I want you to take away from this chapter is that sex and gender are not the same thing, even if these terms are used interchangeably in our society. Sex is the perceived biological characteristics, where gender are the socially constructed ideas that are attached to the biological sex, okay? So those are our social notions of what is masculinity and femininity. Make sure that you watch the videos that I've included in this, because they are really, really helpful in understanding the difference between sex and gender. Your book also talks about intersex, which is another category, right, in which individual does not fit into one of those two biological characteristics. So that binary, we need to kind of question it, right? That's what I want you to kind of think about in this chapter, questioning the binary of both sex and gender. Okay, then there's sexuality, right? Your book talks about the different types of sexuality that exist. Of course, this is an intro class, so we could go a lot deeper, but we're not. Recognizing heterosexuality and how our society is really kind of shaped and based around that heterosexual idea of sexual desire being attached to people of the opposite sex. There is of course, some discussion of the inequalities that exist in relationship to that heteronormative idea, okay, as well. This text really, this chapter really is about gender inequality, and I want us to kind of recognize how gender is that social notion, social constructed idea that is then attached to sex, which then creates the differences in the way that individuals are treated based on their biological sex. So as you're reading through the chapter and you're reading through the theories, I want you to get a general understanding of what each theory is talking about. Where functionalism does have the sex role theory, it is really about kind of the motivation to keep people doing their roles within society. So from a functionalist perspective, thinking about the time frame in which that theory was created, sex role theory would have been at the same time that society was really attempting to reinforce, really create and then reinforce the idea of the nuclear family, where the dad was the provider and the breadwinner and the mom would be the stay-at-home caregiver. Okay, so if you recognize that, then you can kind of see how the society is kind of trying to determine these sex roles, right? That men are supposed to be the instrumental and outside of the home, and women are supposed to be the expressive within the home. So again, recognizing time, place, and situation is always really important, using our sociological imagination to kind of recognize why functionalism came about in the way that it did. And noticing that, okay, is really, really important, okay? Noticing how that shapes why that theory says what it does. Okay, ultimately, if we think about it, it's really kind of saying that we can't have everybody acting exactly the same. We have to have some people who are going to be leaders and some people who are going to be followers. If we think about it from what we learned about functionalism in previous chapters, So basically, this theory is just kind of defined, separated it by sex based on what society was seeing, right? So we have to recognize sex role theory was explaining what was happening at the time that sex role theory was created, okay? It does seem kind of out of date today. However, if you really think about gendered stereotypes and ideas, we can still see how those are reinforced in our society today. Now, conflict theory, of course, is talking about the haves and the have-nots. In this situation, the heterosexual, the male, the biologically male, the more masculine, the more feminine, whatever, depending on which category we're looking at and what we're looking at ranking. Those that have the power are more likely to keep their roles, right? Keep their position and place others in subordinate roles. So if we think about gender inequality and why gender inequality exists, we have created a society in which males have a much greater chance to be dominant, okay? And while I'm not gonna say that all men are against women having some rights, it doesn't benefit them to lose some of their privilege for women to gain some, right? To gain some access to resources. So what I want you to recognize from a conflict perspective, there is a struggle for resources, power, influence, and men and women are going to be at odds in relationship to that, okay? Recognizing, again, we learned about privilege in chapter 7, right? But privilege is an unearned advantage, and our society is a hegemonic society. It is a patriarchal society in which men are more in power and have more influence, and that will shape the struggle between men and women. Again, but I do want us to recognize the gender roles are oppressive to men as well, right? The gendered ideas of masculinity can be oppressive to men, just like the gender roles that are attached to women. It's just unfortunate that in our society, men are benefiting at the macro level and at a disadvantage at the micro level, where it's the other way around for women. They may have more of an advantage at the micro level, but they're at a disadvantage because of that advantage at the micro level. They're at a disadvantage at the macro level. So it's kind of that back and forth. When we think about the interactionist perspective, symbolic interactionism is that social construction, thinking about how our gendered norms are taught to us and reinforced, okay? Feminist theory is also, and queer theory are also discussed in this text, kind of recognizing how those are each talking about inequalities. Okay, and then your book talks also about life chances, just like it did in chapter 7 and in chapters 8. Different categories of people will have different opportunities, right? So recognizing how sex and gender can shape those life chances or our opportunities is extremely important when we're considering inequality in the structure and social mobility, okay? The feminist movement, your textbook does talk about the feminist movement and the different waves, kind of recognizing those and understanding them. Make sure you watch all of the videos that I've given you. Make sure to complete your inquisitive, your data workshop, take your quiz, do your discussion boards as early as possible so that you can get feedback from your classmates and from myself if you have questions. We're getting close to the end now. So this is, again, chapter 9. So let me know if you have any questions. All right, have a great day.